Hello and welcome. I'm Christine Bevick, task lead for Recover at the Administrative Coordinating Center and moderator for today's webinar. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's Recover Research Review, or R3 webinar. The overarching goal of this webinar series is to catalyze the formation of scientific stakeholder community within and beyond the Recover Consortium. It's fostering a shared understanding of the state of science and providing an educational resource to both Recover investigators and the broader scientific community of clinicians, patients, and public stakeholders. I want to start by thanking everyone who submitted questions in advance. We have those, and we're hoping to get to as many of those as possible. During today's webinar, as Shane mentioned, please use the Q&A feature to submit those. And after the presentation today, our presenters are going to be answering as many of those as possible and providing responses in real time within the Q&A. So you can check back and see if they've actually responded to your questions there. Please note that we will not be answering any questions about clinical care. Afterwards, the NFAQ document for this webinar is going to be posted along with the recording on recovercovid.org. Today's webinar is part of our ongoing series, Recover in Action. And for today, we're focusing on the status of Recover clinical trial protocols. Our panel today will take us through the landscape of long COVID's clinical trials and the development of Recover's upcoming clinical trials. If you haven't already, remember to sign up on the website to receive future announcements and updates for the series. As Recover continues to grow, we want to remind our audience the information presented in this seminar is intended to stimulate collaborative dialogue amongst the Recover scientific community, as well as study participants and other interested parties. In addition, our disclaimer of that none of this information should be interpreted as medical advice. So please join me in welcoming three members of the Recover Clinical Trials team joining us today. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eldrin Lewis, Dr. Kanecia Zimmerman, and Ms. Renee Leverty. They're joined by our discussants, Maughan and Marta Cerda, who will help kick off our discussion and response portion of our webinar. And also we're joined by Dr. Hernandez from the DCRI Institute at Duke. Our first presenter today is Dr. Eldrin Lewis. Dr. Lewis currently serves as the co-chair of the Recover Clinical Trials Steering Committee. He's also chief of the Division of Cardiovascular Medicine and a professor of cardiovascular medicine at Stanford University. Dr. Lewis is going to introduce us to the landscape of long COVID trials and the Recover's progress to date. And then next, we're going to hear from Dr. Kanecia Zimmerman. Dr. Zimmerman is the PI, Principal Investigator of the Recover Clinical Trials Data Coordinating Center, CTDCC, at DCRI, which stands for the Duke Clinical Research Institute at Duke University. And Dr. Zimmerman will share more information on the overview and status of the planned clinical trials. And then we're going to wrap things up and hear from Ms. Renee Leverty, who will talk us through about the inclusion of patient representatives throughout the clinical trials development process. And Ms. Leverty is the engagement lead for the Recover clinical trials and also serves as the program lead for stakeholder engagement at the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Our panelists are also joined by two of our Recover patient representatives. I mentioned them, Maughan and Marta Cerda, and they're going to help lead off our discussion with a short series of questions for our panelists, as well as speaking to some of their experiences. So following those questions, we're going to open the floor to questions from our audience. And as mentioned, we're going to try and answer as many of those as we can today. So please welcome all of our speakers as we turn things over to Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bevick. I appreciate this opportunity. And you see the agenda that we're going to go over. And so what I would like to do is to talk a little bit about understanding long COVID. And so on the next slide, you will see that there are a lot of potential causes for long COVID. It's defined as a kind of a set of multiple conditions with diverse clinical manifestations that can affect every major organ tissue system, reflecting a varied potential of underlying and coexisting causes. And we know that because of this, people can have a broad range of symptoms and experiences when they suffer from long COVID. Some examples of hypothesized causes that can coexist in the same patient can be persistent virus or antigens, reactivation of other viruses, an uncontrolled immune response, as well as damage to a wide range of organs and tissues, including the heart, lungs, the nerves, nervous system, the GI tract, and the brain. We also know that there can be injury to blood vessels and abnormal blood clotting that can lead to comorbid conditions. And because of this diverse set of clinical conditions really provided the need to do a broad portfolio of therapeutic interventions and agents that can potentially improve outcomes. On the next slide, I would tell you a little bit about the Recover Initiative. And on the next slide. So Recover is a patient-centered, integrated, adaptive research network. I've been doing clinical trials for over 2 decades, and I have to say that the participation of patients in the design, the execution of this study, I think is really important, especially because we're all learning together. There is a lot to learn. We know that the goal is to predict, treat, prevent long COVID or PASC. It's a patient-centered, patient perspective, but we also know that we have platform protocols with common data elements across all of the trials. This is important so that when we look at interventions, we'll be able to compare apples to apples, and that we'll be able to look at similar data elements at baseline, patient characteristics, to better understand and cross-pollinate our understanding across multiple interventions. This is also an adaptive approach so that we can continue to look for the emerging science and implement it into a facile way. And we know that this is a national scale. This is a broad-based problem, and we want to have inclusive participation with the understanding that the impact of long COVID can be varied in different patient population scenarios and environmental situations. So the scientific aims are to understand the range of recovery and changes in our bodies over time, to define the risk factors, the number of people getting long COVID, and if there are specific different long COVID types, to study how long COVID progresses over time and how that can relate to comorbid conditions that people may have before they've developed this syndrome. And then finally, to identify possible treatments to help with the long COVID symptoms. So how does this work? Well, there's research components and there's also information exchange. And we're glad that you're all here to hear this presentation. We know that there are patients, caregivers, community representatives, work groups, and governance committees, all who have a vested interest in the outcomes of Recover and are interested in being part of the solution. So we can learn from people, from clinical study groups who have a lot of content expertise in long COVID, tissue pathology and autopsy expertise, as well as community-based study groups who are at the grassroots understanding how it impacts day-to-day lives. But we also know on the clinical science side, there's pathobiology that we need to understand, and we need to use real-world data with electronic health records, mobile health apps, and digital apps. And all of this will allow us to have to maximize data harmonization and sharing, including understanding each study treatment, with each clinical trial that we're going to run, and how it relates to outcomes and how it's related to baseline characteristics. And then finally, the next slide. So this is just a snapshot of where we are and where we hope to go. So Recover is really going to be the largest, diverse, deeply characterized clinical cohort of long COVID patients. As you know, because of how disruptive this pandemic has been, We have seen countless numbers of publications at an exponential pace for COVID. And for long COVID, we see a lot of data as well. But the pinnacle of data is really to have precise randomized trials where we can actually answer a hypothesis-driven question. So this will provide insights into long COVID, the prevalence, risk factors, impact, and disparities from EHR. We'll have a robust longitudinal characterization of long COVID patients, and there are over 40 studies to characterize the pathophysiology of long COVID. And then we have these 5 platform protocol clinical trials. So in the future, we'll have the interim analysis, the cross-validation of EHR or electronic health record findings with clinical cohort data. We'll be able to integrate wearable sensor data in the adult cohort study, and we'll have mechanistic studies, risk stratification, and biomarker identification, which can be very helpful for individual patients as they're trying to live with long COVID. And then finally, we're launching the trials evaluating treatments. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. And next, we're bringing back Dr. Kanecia Zimmerman to share more details on the RECOVER clinical trials. Dr. Zimmerman.
Thank you so much. So over the next couple of slides, I'll talk some about kind of the general approach to clinical trials, all the people who've been involved, and talk more specifically about the platform trials themselves. I also just want to kind of put out there that everything for those of you who've been involved in RECOVER, RECOVER is ever changing. There's lots of things that are happening all the time as we're learning more information, and Dr. Lewis talked a little bit about that. So this is a bit of a snapshot of where we are right now, but certainly expect things to evolve over time, and please know that there's progress that's happening as things are moving along. Next slide, please. So there have been really so many people and groups that have been involved in this clinical trial development and the design. As Dr. Lewis mentioned, and as Ms. Leverty will talk about later, patients have been really an integral part of this, and patient advocates have also been really important and have had a lot of input on our working groups, et cetera, as we've moved forward with developing the trials. We've had input from clinicians, those who are taking care of patients with long COVID every single day, as well as researchers who know things about design of clinical trials, for example, and who have had prior experiences with taking care of people with post-viral syndromes and even researching post-viral syndromes themselves. We've, of course, had input from the FDA and other regulatory agencies as we've gone throughout this process. It's been great also to be able to capitalize on some of the data that is coming out of the RECOVER cohorts and all the things that Dr. Lewis mentioned about all the studies that are kind of up and moving with RECOVER to date, to really identify the major symptom clusters, as well as really understand how symptoms might align, for example, with some of the tests that we might want to do in a standard clinical trial. Patient perspectives have really informed the symptom cluster prioritization, as well as some of the interventions and other trial concepts. And then also the broad research community has provided their input as to what things and how things should be studied. And we're also happy to have some industry collaborations so that we can make sure that we continue to move these platforms forward. Next slide, please. So there are a number of, there's a central goal, obviously, to identify treatment strategies for long COVID. The objectives underneath this goal are to really investigate some priority symptom clusters and their causes, to test known and novel interventions across multiple domains. So that means drugs and devices and even non-pharmacologic types of therapies, and ultimately to evaluate the treatments to improve long COVID symptoms. Next slide, please. So there are 5 protocols that are focused on symptom clusters as Dr. Lewis mentioned, but we are really focusing not only on symptom clusters, like what have we identified as really bothersome and burdensome to people, really having an impact, but also what are the underlying etiologies, and can we address those underlying etiologies? I think that's a really kind of important dichotomy or differences between those two things, that we're really trying to address it from all different angles. As I mentioned, there are a number of teams who've been involved with this. There have been lots of interventions that have been evaluated, but we expect that, what I show you today is kind of the start of things. We expect and hope that things will come later on, that there will be additional interventions that can be added on. And we're hopeful that the way that the Clinical Trials Data Coordinating Center and the way the trials themselves have been designed really are nimble and allow for things to happen. Next slide, please. So one of the ways in which we are hoping to be nimble is that we've designed the trials, or are in the process of designing the trials, to be kind of a platform clinical trial design. Many of you may already be familiar with how this works, but the idea is that you could potentially have a control arm and then multiple interventions, some of which could go forward and we could see that they're great and they might be able to, maybe we move them to a phase 3 trial or additional investigation. There are others that that might not do so well, or we have early indications that they're not going to do well, and therefore could easily be dropped and easily added to the platform itself. Next slide, please. So other thinking around the platform protocols really is to be comprehensive and integrated. So by kind of having things centralized at the CTDCC, or thinking about how we might have single IRBs and DSMBs to make sure that there's appropriate information and appropriate expertise on the DSMB to make sure that they're weighing in on the safety and the specific aspects of the specific protocols, but also a core group of people that might be able to be nimble and address things on a relatively frequent basis, and to be very familiar with how Recover is operating. There is trial oversight, obviously, by the single IRB, the DSMB, but also the operational oversight as well, and operational management of the trials. There's data analyses that are going to be centralized and then hopefully combined with some of the information that we are learning from the Recover cohorts, and then a large number of trial or clinical sites that might enroll in multiple different protocols, so that they might actually be able to take advantage of looking at the EHR, for example, and seeing, oh, this person might not qualify for this study, but they might actually qualify for this study. So those kind of centralized processes where we are really thinking very carefully about. And then finally, long-term follow-up of participants. I know that there have been a number of questions. For example, are there certain populations who might have brain fog that leads down the road to something like Alzheimer's? The other thing that's been really important here, and Dr. Lewis mentioned this a little bit, is to really think about how we might be able to learn as much as possible from all the trials that are moving forward. So having shared endpoints, having a very similar patient population when it makes sense, or approach to inclusion in general, making sure that some of the controls might be able to be shared across within a platform protocol, but maybe even understanding how that works across protocols. We've been very thoughtful of making sure that if there are evaluations of post-exertional malaise, for example, that are happening in one protocol, we know that just because you have autonomic dysfunction doesn't mean that you don't have post-exertional malaise. So making sure we're also looking at some of those things. There have been lots of people who have had lots of input, not only in single trials, but also across the program itself, so that we can make sure that we are harmonizing information. We're using common data elements so that the information can be compared and contrasted in the future. And then really, really important to make sure that we are understanding mechanisms underlying not only this etiologic platform, or where we're thinking about things like viral persistence or microclots or something along those lines, but also thinking about well, if I'm in this symptom-specific platform, how can I also understand what's happening there? So samples will be really important so that we can identify specific biomarkers, and we can trend those over time and across protocols. So the hope is that these would be, that these are integrated, that these are comprehensive, and that we can achieve a lot of efficiencies to really be nimble, to be as rapid as possible once these protocols get up and moving. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are 5 platform protocols. On the left here, you see this idea that we are kind of looking at these etiologic pathways. So things like viral persistence and reactivation and immune dysregulation that might be underpinning a lot of the symptoms that we have that are manifesting in people, but also looking at specific symptom clusters. So really focusing in on those who have cognitive dysfunction, those who have autonomic dysfunction, those who might have issues with sleep, and those who might have issues with cardiopulmonary exercise intolerance and fatigue. Next slide, please. So I mentioned these already, but I wanted to just make sure that people kind of understand the definitions here. So viral persistence, we're really talking and thinking about the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 may stay in the body, that may be hiding out in what we're calling sanctuary sites. And it may itself cause damage. It may cause the immune system to overreact. It may cause damage to the blood vessels and clotting. And all of that might actually be playing a role in why we're seeing some of the symptoms we're seeing. When we're talking about autonomic dysfunction, there are lots and lots of symptoms that might be caused by autonomic dysfunction or an issue of the nervous system. And it might manifest as things like dizziness or a fast heart rate, shortness of breath, problems with your digestive system, where you might have nausea or vomiting, for example, or feeling really full too early, or other symptoms that might be related to the autonomic nervous system. Sleep disturbances, there are a number of things that are within this particular category, but really thinking about your changes in sleep patterns or the ability to sleep. Cognitive dysfunction, many people know this as brain fog or the inability to think very clearly. And then when we're talking about exercise intolerance and fatigue, post-exertional malaise, we're really thinking about a person's activity or energy level that interferes with daily activities, recognizing that some of that stuff may happen or some of these symptoms may happen while people are doing activities, but some of it might happen after people have done activities and they have what's called a crash or post-exertional malaise that we see in conditions such as ME/CFS. Next slide, please. So each of these trial platforms has really been developed or is in the process of being developed by a protocol working group. There are patient representatives, there are scientific experts in the symptom areas themselves, there are experts in interventions, there are investigators who sometimes are experts in the interventions or the symptom areas, but they have submitted information to the NIH to be a part of, to have their intervention be in their trial thought process part of Recover. And then there's also representatives from the Recover observational cohorts. The protocol working groups have met regularly to develop the platform protocols and the appendices, or that's kind of each of the arms that we're thinking about, but also really thinking about like, how are we going to do that? So if we're thinking about, for example, having 2 drugs, so how do we make sure that we're screening people appropriately? They can go right down the right pathway. Are there other conditions that need to be screened for? For example, if people have issues with sleep, are we making sure that their issue with sleep isn't secondary or isn't because of something like obstructive sleep apnea? So people thinking very carefully about the details. And then even once the protocol working groups have been up and kind of moving, we are also trying to get input from people who are going to execute this at the sites. So does this actually make sense? And how would you operationalize this? Or are there other ways to do it better? Next slide, please. So just in thinking about these 5 platform trials, in total, we think that we will be enrolling approximately 2,600 participants for the first round of interventions. The recruitment will largely be based at sites. So it will be really important for us to think about what sites have what capabilities and what populations to make sure that we're as inclusive as possible and also can get some of the scientific questions answered. Like specific sites have specific expertise in specific biomarkers, for example. So we want to make sure that we're capturing those people as well. We will have a range of numbers of sites for each of the trials, 25 to 100 in some cases, and then there will be more information about enrollment in the coming months. Sorry, next slide, please. So many of you may also be familiar with this idea of how do we get from this protocol to actually getting people into the trials. And this schematic is really just to emphasize that there are multiple rounds of review, not only by the DSMB and the IRB, but the FDA has done a lot of weighing in on making sure that the protocols are reasonable, that they actually might lead to something in the future, that we can answer specific questions, that they provide information that the FDA might need. So this is an iterative process that may occur for each of the protocols moving forward. Next slide, please. So over the next couple of slides, I'll just talk some generalities about the protocols themselves. Viral persistence in particular, it's really looking at, does the study intervention improve outcomes for people with ongoing symptoms from PASC? This will enroll approximately 900 adults who might fit into 3 symptom clusters. And those 3 symptom clusters are things like post-exertional malaise. It is things like autonomic dysfunction and brain fog. So each of those will have approximately 300 people within each of those clusters. The first intervention is going to be an antiviral drug, and we're looking primarily at patient-reported outcomes, but also some performance-based outcomes. So within each of these symptom clusters, performance-based outcome measures, for example, might be a neurocognitive battery. So if you have brain fog, we want to know how you're functioning and how you're telling us you're functioning, but we also want to know what happens when you take these more standardized tests. And then because we're giving a drug, really looking at safety and tolerability. There'll be up to 100 sites, and our hope is that we can launch this trial in late summer of this year. Next slide, please. So a second trial or platform is cognitive dysfunction, really looking at whether or not there are improved outcomes for people with cognitive decline that's related to post-acute sequela of SARS-CoV-2 or long COVID. This will enroll approximately 315 adults with cognitive dysfunction from PASC. The intervention is going to be different forms of cognitive training, and the outcomes are going to be some patient-reported outcomes, but again, thinking about what people might actually be able to do on something like a neurocognitive battery. If we're taking specific tests that have been used in the past for different populations of people with cognitive decline, how do people perform? This will be up to 45 sites and hoping to launch in the late summer as well. Next slide, please. A third is the sleep disturbances, and looking at whether or not a study intervention improves patient-reported outcomes for people with sleep disturbances from PASC. There are a number of different types of sleep disturbances. So there's hypersomnia, for example, but there's also things that are like circadian rhythm disorders or insomnia. So we will be looking at these phenotypes separately for now, and enrolling approximately 474 adults with sleep disturbances, predominantly hypersomnia from PASC. Also looking at things like patient-reported outcomes, sleep outcomes. We want to make sure, we want to understand like how long people are sleeping, when they're going to sleep, et cetera. There will be some pharmacologic and non-pharmacologic therapies that will be here. And so for the pharmacologic therapies in particular, interested in safety and tolerability. So we performed in up to 100 sites and anticipated launch in the fall. Next slide, please. For exercise intolerance and fatigue, we're really interested in whether or not a study intervention improves outcomes for people with exercise intolerance, symptoms from PASC. We'll be looking at approximately 360 adults. And the intervention here is cardiopulmonary rehabilitation. There are both patient-reported outcomes and functional outcomes as well. This will be done in up to 50 sites and launching hopefully in the fall of this year. Next slide, please. And then finally, autonomic dysfunction. So thinking about whether or not the intervention helps improve outcomes for people with autonomic symptoms from PASC. We're looking at 360 adults who experience these specific symptoms. And we are looking at not only pharmacologic therapies, including immunotherapies, as well as non-pharmacologic therapies. We are interested in not only patient-reported outcomes, but also there are obviously lots and lots of tests and evaluations that can be done for autonomic dysfunction, specifically because of how many systems or kind of organ systems this really could affect. So also looking at some of that, and interested in safety and tolerability. This will be performed at up to 75 sites and launched later this year. Next slide, please. All right, with that, I will pass it over to Ms. Leverty.
All right, thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. So we're going to bring on Ms. Renee Leverty to give us some information about the patient and community engagement and recover community clinical trials. As a quick reminder, if you have a question for any of our panelists, you can drop those into the Q&A feature, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. All right, Renee?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. So I am the Associate Director of Research Together at Duke Clinical Research Institute. And what my team and I strive for is to develop infrastructure and systems to amplify and bridge lived experience knowledge so it can influence and impact study design and study conduct. Next slide. So for patient engagement in the clinical trials, patient representatives are on the PASC Intervention Prioritization Committee and suggest therapies and interventions that they either have personal experience with or have seen work within the long COVID community. Patient reps have completed surveys and questionnaires and were involved in the ROA review process. And patients are integrated into protocol working groups. Next slide. So engagement in the platform protocol. Recover patient representatives that were part of the review of applications for clinical trials were invited as experts to be part of protocol writing teams. 2 patient and community reps are on each protocol working group. Being a member of that working group, they attend working group meetings, receive the protocol and DSMB feedback in various stages, the informed consent, and are part of email discussions and exchange of ideas. There's an extended group of patient reps and what we call the small group, which are associated with the protocols, but not directly on protocol working groups. This group has met with the study co-chairs and co-investigators outside of the larger working group meetings. The goal of that is to create an opportunity for more focused conversations on patient priorities. Additionally, 3 out of the 5 small groups, again, 1 linked to each platform protocol writing group, have met with NIH leadership, and the other 2 meetings are being planned. Patient representatives are also members of the Clinical Trial Steering Committee. And since patient engagement may be new to individuals on the protocol working groups, we created engagement training for the operations team and support for the researchers. We brought together diverse patient and community reps who are newer or have never been in research to assess protocol visit cadence and activities to better understand the patient journey and the potential burden, and also engaged with the National Community Engagement Group, the NCAG, which serves as a central forum for Recover to promote meaningful discussion through partnership and shared decision-making. Next slide. So impact of patient experience on clinical trials. Helping align unmet needs of patient and communities with the research goals. Develop endpoints and outcomes most meaningful to patients. There have been robust discussions around inclusion, exclusion, benefit, and risk. create least burdensome procedures and schedules, as well as sharing experiences and recommendations about what data to collect. Work to decrease barriers to recruitment and participation, increase understanding around cultural beliefs and values in order to ultimately create an inclusive and supportive research participant experience. And this will happen later in the program, but develop strategies for engagement and distribution of findings. We understand that dissemination of findings needs to be done in partnership with patients, communities, and advocacy groups. Next slide, please. So we want to thank the patient and community representatives who are on the protocol teams and small groups, who are attending meetings, reading incredibly dense documents, and giving feedback while experiencing a complex and at times debilitating chronic illness. The Recover National Community Engagement Group and subcommittees for their leadership and insights. And to patient advocacy organizations and people living with long COVID, we know this work to understand PASC started long before we came to the table. And we are thankful for your work and how it informs clinical trials. Next slide, please. And you can go to the next slide, thanks. So future updates about clinical trials and all aspects of Recover research can be found by visiting recovercovid.org. We will post the final clinical trial protocols when they are ready and also provide updates about enrollment status and next steps. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. And I want to bring in two of our patient reps that have been part of this process. So let's go ahead and bring in Christine Maughan and Marta Cerda to help us better understand what these clinical trials mean from the patient patient perspective and what questions they have about these clinical trials. So Marta, do you want to start us off, and then we can bring in Christine to share her thoughts as well?
Thank you, Christine. I'm Marta Cerda. I experienced Recover in a couple of ways. First, I was a Recover study participant. There, I answered questions and have annual examinations, which helped me to understand that I've lost 30% of my taste and smell due to long COVID, for example. Then, secondly, I experienced Recover as a participant in the steering committee. As has just been mentioned, we do participate as patients in community engagement committee and in discussions around the development of the clinical trials. I also wanted to add that my agency also helps with community outreach for the Recover study itself by working to engage minority members in addressing their fears and concerns and digital literacy issues so they can enter the study themselves to learn more about long COVID. Most important for me, participating in the Recover Task Force at first was nerve-wracking a little bit because I was not sure I was going to be able to keep up with these complex discussions around this very complex illness. But fortunately, due to the fact that they do take time to explain very carefully their decisions and the protocol, I was able to provide input on how this illness has impacted me and on the clinical trials as they have been developing. What has happened as a result is that I have developed a higher level or a deeper understanding of my own long COVID illness. For example, through participating in a breakout group on the trials around the stomach, that is where I learned that vomiting and nausea and stomach pains, random stomach pains that I had been experiencing a few months ago, are a part of long COVID. Next, we had meetings around PEM exercise intolerance. And it was during these discussions of this moderate, mild, moderate, and severe PEM that I realized that I myself have PEM. I thought I was just not wanting to exercise. But in listening to those discussions around the development of this trial, that's where I had an understanding that I too have those two illnesses. And this was very important to me because I had been to my primary care physician, and that physician had no answers or no answers to me around what these issues were or what could be done about them. So for me, my participation in the task force has been invaluable. Next, I did want to say that the community engagement team really thoughtfully works on dealing with bringing in the Latino, African American, and Asian communities. I participated in the development of the marketing materials for those communities, for example, so we can better draw in communities that are deeply impacted by long COVID, so we can find treatments and hopefully a cure at some point for this illness. Next, I did want to say that I do have many, many hopes for the trials. I am hopeful that there will be some form of treatment, or whether it be medication or therapies that can assist with issues that I do tackle every day, with brain fog, as was mentioned earlier, with heart racing, issues around my lungs, and sometimes stuttering, for example. Some of the, I would say, the more severe aspects of long COVID, I am very much more hopeful through my participation in the task force that we will come up with solutions going forward. And lastly, I wanted to say that when I first entered the task force, I was concerned about whether or not I would be able to participate, because they're very challenging conversations between scientists and physicians. But I have to say the team carefully explains what is going on, and they give us, as patients, opportunities to provide input. And that is why I have been able to contribute to the trials, so they can better address the issues that we face as patients tackling this, again, complex illness every day. And I'll turn it over to Christine Maughan.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As previously mentioned, I am one of the patient representatives on the steering committee for clinical trials, and was asked to share a bit about my experience with Recover so far and my hopes for this work moving forward. My involvement with Recover started due to an early COVID infection and a community of patient advocates who pushed for answers at a time when we had none. In March of 2020, I began experiencing my first COVID symptoms, and I later tested positive in early April. At that time, we had been told that if we caught COVID and were lucky enough to survive, we would be better in 2 weeks. When those 2 weeks came and went and we were still sick, we knew something was very wrong. In those early days of the pandemic, when we did reach out for help, many of us were met with confusion at best and disbelief at worst. So we turned to each other. Through various online forums and social media outlets, patients who were still sick long past those 14 days began posting their symptoms and began forming groups and began advocating for recognition, research, and care. And during this process, we learned that it was not all in our heads, that we weren't alone, and that this was so much more common than any of us could have imagined. When I first joined the Utah COVID-19 Long Haulers Facebook group, a group I now help moderate, I was the third member. We now have almost 4,400 members. It is through this community and its fearless leader, Lisa O'Brien, who I know is listening in today, that we began discussions with researchers and staff at the University of Utah, advocating for one of Utah's first long COVID clinics, and eventually found our way to Recover. Now, over 3 years later, long COVID symptoms still impact my daily life. And while my good days are better than they used to be, I still have many bad days when I struggle to even get out of bed. Due to these ongoing symptoms, I now participate in the Recover observational cohort as a long COVID patient, where I've been asked to contribute everything from blood samples to 6-minute walk test and so much more. And many of us, myself included, have helped shape Recover due to work as patient, community, and caregiver representatives. I serve on the National Community Engagement Group, or NCEG, a group tasked with ensuring that Recover research meets the needs of patients, caregivers, and community members. I am also on the Publications Subcommittee, a group which helps ensure patient and community reps are included and engaged in the publications process for Recover. And I serve on the steering committee for clinical trials, the focus of our presentation today, and the protocol working group examining the possibility of viral persistence and potential treatments therein. I attend these meetings from my couch with my feet elevated on a stool to help counter my orthostatic intolerance, something I know many of the patients listening today can relate to. And I often leave my camera off to help conserve my energy. Through all of this, I take with me those early discussions and sense of community we formed as patients when we had no one to turn to but each other. I know I may not always get it right, and I've had plenty of stumbles along the way, but I try to remember every story that's been shared with me the past 3 years and ask myself, how best can we serve those patients? My hope is that Recover will learn from the work of these patient advocates and understand that we are the experts of our own lived experiences. In order to know how best to treat long COVID, we must first understand its impacts, and who better to learn that from than those who live with it daily. Thanks in large part to the tireless work of patient advocates, we have reached a place where groups such as Recover are beginning to trial treatments. It is also my hope that throughout this process, we continue to engage with those who live daily with the struggles of long COVID, and that we may find meaningful ways to improve their lives. I'm grateful for this opportunity, but more importantly, I am grateful to the many patient advocates whom I know are listening in today. We would not be here without you. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. And I want to invite our entire panel to turn their cameras back on and join us. We have a good amount of time for some questions. So I want to pose our first question to our patient reps while we have them, to ask them, what have you learned about this, the clinical trial development process through this experience? What continues to motivate you there?
I can take this, and thank you. I think what has struck me the most is just how much work goes into these clinical trials. It's been really interesting to hear all of the different experts give their advice and opinions, and to see the way that the trials have been modified along the way. I've definitely learned a lot. It's been an interesting process.
Yeah, I would have to agree that seeing the debate between the researchers has been fascinating. So someone will come in with expertise in that particular area, and they'll bring that information to the team, and that will alter the way the trial proceeds and the protocol is developed. So seeing that engagement, and I have to say, the commitment of this task force team is incredible. They're really committed to finding solutions. And so they do listen thoughtfully to each other and to their colleagues. So that process has been a good one to learn about. Before this process, I had only seen, presentations about clinical trials. So I understood the framework, but seeing the actual going from point A to point B has been a good learning process, and they have accepted our input always.
All right, thank you. And I just wanted to quickly introduce the additional member to our audience, Dr. Adrian Hernandez, the Executive Director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute at Duke University. Welcome. Our next question, and this also is going to hit on a couple of the questions that we've seen come in from our audience members about recruitment. So how are these clinical trials recruiting participants? How are you going to reach underserved communities and those who may not know that their symptoms could be long COVID?
I'm happy to start and happy to have people add when it's appropriate. So the recruitment will primarily be site-based. The idea is that we would have a wide range of sites over a group, like a wide range of geographic locations, and making sure that the sites have certain capabilities. So there may be sites that we're looking for that, as I mentioned, have expertise in something called PBMCs, which is like special labs that could be done, but only certain sites could actually do them because they had the appropriate things to process, et cetera. So we would be looking for sites that have that type of expertise. There are also some sites that might have the capabilities of doing things like cardiopulmonary exercise testing. Not every site can do that, but we want to make sure that we are, if that trial calls for at least some sites to have cardiopulmonary exercise testing, for example. We want to make sure that we're including some sites that have that capability. But we also are really, really interested in being inclusive as far as our population. So looking for sites who care for patients who may be underserved, who usually aren't able to participate in clinical trials. And as we've been designing the trials, we've really tried to be very thoughtful about kind of what is the lowest common denominator to make sure that of the sites, right? Like what is it that we actually need from every single site to make sure that sites that don't necessarily do clinical trials on the regular basis, although they have the want, the desire, the population, how can we make sure that they're also included? And I think as far as the second question, Christine, like just thinking about how do we, make sure that people who don't know that they have long COVID can understand that, that's our job, right? Like that's our job of everyone that's part of this panel. It's the job of hopefully all the patients and patient advocates that are watching today. Like we got to get the word out because it's very possible that people like Marta, for example, Miss Cerda, she mentioned that she didn't even know that that was one of her, her symptoms. And there's certainly other populations. We've done listening sessions that say like, oh my gosh, I just thought I was really, really tired because I had to work so much because the economy isn't that great, right? Like I'm working 2 jobs now as opposed to 1. And I just thought I was really, really tired. So those types of things, it's our responsibility to get that information out.
One other note along with what Kanecia said is that, I think everyone's hoping that the Recover program is a continuous process. So as results are generated from the clinical trials, and if they have an impact on an area, how can we get that to every corner of the U.S. and around the world as soon as possible? It seems like this community that's extremely motivated because either they've been in touch with the people who've had problems with long COVID or living with it and so forth are going to be the greatest channels for getting results to the people who are suffering from long COVID. And to Kanecia's point here is making sure that people are recognizing this. They may assume that they have something else and aren't actually seeking attention. So this seems like it's going to be a full-on affair.
I was just going to add that I'm very passionate. I'm very passionate about letting people know the symptoms that I do have. On panel discussions, I'm doing another one next week at the State of Illinois building downstate, so that they understand that they're not alone, that other people have these issues around brain fog or stuttering or shortness of breath, all of that. So I have engaged, even being interviewed here by ABC7 Chicago. So I get out the word about those symptoms. I do think far too many people don't know they have long COVID and they could get help. Sorry, Renee.
And I'll add that we have bilingual staff and also look for sites with bilingual staff, developing community engagement toolkits. And we want to partner with already trusted resources within the communities at a local and national level. So please reach out because we know it's these already formed relationships that will help us share the messaging about the work of Recover.
And for those that are interested in reaching out, how do they do that? Where can they go?
Yeah, we can put the email in the Q&A.
All right, great. And then Dr. Zimmerman, on the site selection, are those forthcoming? I know you mentioned a couple months from now. When could folks expect to hear about those and find out where they are and whether there's a site near them and what they should do if there isn't a site near them?
Right. It's a great question. So yes, that information is certainly forthcoming. We have started getting some interest from sites, or at least like sending out information like, do you have this? Do you have this capability? Do you have this capability? To see whether or not sites are interested and who might be interested, and making sure that they can identify who the people are at their team, who their team is actually at the site to be able to do some of the work. So that process is happening right now for the trials that may start up earlier rather than later. The information about the sites will eventually be posted on the Recover COVID COVID, right? .org. Is that right? recovercovid.org.
Yeah.
So that will be there. And then, I think that we need to be, I think, very thoughtful about where, if people do not have a specific site that's in their vicinity, there is a list right now that's being generated for people who are interested in clinical trials to make sure that they can have the appropriate information. I hope that's helpful, Christine.
Yeah, and again, all this is, we're recording this, so it will be posted, and then also the questions and answers are going to be compiled into a document as well and posted on the website for folks. So the next one, I want to get into the effects of cardiopulmonary rehabilitation and PEM and the post-exertional malaise. And this is a question I am seeing come in over here on this side. There are lots of questions about this. And I wonder if you guys can help unpack that a little bit and how that's fitting into the exercise intolerance protocol and how you're going to monitor for safety and all the different decisions that went into the measures and that component. So Dr. Lewis, Dr. Zimmerman, do you want to start us off and then we can open it up, or who wants to go first?
Kanecia, do you want to start?
Sure, I can certainly start. So I will just start by saying that this is a work in progress to really define not only the intervention, like what exactly that looks like, but who the appropriate population is for this particular trial. I want to say also that we have certainly heard the patient feedback. Here, there have been, lots of people who've given feedback, but also the people in the working group, the patients in the working group have been intimately involved in this process to tell us, like, absolutely not, that's not appropriate, or this seems to be appropriate. And that's gone back and forth with, executive committees and steering committees, et cetera. And so people are committed to getting this right and to making sure that it is first and foremost safe. So while I can't tell you exactly what the cardiopulmonary rehab intervention looks like right now, I can tell you that safety is at the center of everything that's being done, from the inclusion criteria to the intervention itself. And we are very much aware of those with post-exertional malaise, those with MECFS-like phenotype, and those also who have exercise intolerance, where they're having difficulty as the activity is happening. I mean, we want to make sure that we are thoughtful about all those things. And we also want to make sure that once we have a trial, once there's, the appropriate population that's in that trial, that we in the future are also communicating what happens, right? And we're communicating it with all the nuances so that it doesn't necessarily turn into a global recommendation for everyone if that isn't the population who is in the trial. So I hopefully that's a start. Dr. Lewis, please take it away from there. But I just want to emphasize, like, there's the DSMB. Our teams are being very thoughtful about it. Safety is number one on the list.
Absolutely. And it's really challenging. And certainly we've heard a lot of the feedback. And I want to say that the PASC population with exercise intolerance is different in many ways from your classic PEM, especially the severe PEM. But that being said, because there are overlapping symptoms, what we don't want would be to have people who have severe PEM as an initial component of this trial. And one of the things that I would just emphasize is many times when there has been a decade or 2 decades of clinical treatment, perception of understanding, it becomes really challenging to answer a question because we feel that we know the answer. And I used to give lectures on this in cardiovascular disease as a heart failure and transplant cardiologist. Adrian would know this as well. For a long time, we never gave beta blockers because we said, why would you give a beta blocker to someone who is chronotropically or inotropically challenged? And so we we basically didn't use a therapy for a long time in heart failure because of the perception that beta blockers will harm patients. And in fact, I still remember when I was early in my career, when someone actually screamed, why are you trying to kill my patient by giving beta blockers? When the first trial came out that basically showed that beta blockers were associated with a 34% improvement in survival. One that a lot of people know is hormone replacement therapy. When I was in medical school, we used to use HRT as a standard treatment for women who were perimenopausal, thinking that we were improving cardiovascular risk until we did the WHI. And when that was done, and it was a randomized trial, you saw that there was actually no benefit, in fact, harm. So once again, one of the hardest things to do is to actually test it. What you want to do is to ensure that each participant, each 360 of those participants, will be studied in a safe way. And I think it's really important that we understand this. The last example I will give, and then I'll pass it over to Adrian, is exercise. If you look at guidelines in years past in heart failure, they would say, why are you going to exercise? That's dangerous. You can't, people with heart failure cannot exercise. They're going to have arrhythmias. They're going to drop dead. We should not recommend exercise. People with heart failure should sit in their chair until they die. And that sounds cruel, but that's basically what we were doing. And we didn't realize until we actually had in a safe way study, can exercise make a difference? That actually start saying, okay, you know what, you should exercise. Here's a safe way to exercise. You're not going to start with the sickest people when you're going to do that protocol, people who are on life-sustaining intravenous drugs. You're going to start with the healthier population with heart failure and then do it. And there was a cardiac rehab study where you looked in heart failure patients who are moderate to high risk and randomized them to rehab versus usual care, and randomized over 800 patients in 81 centers. So it can be done. But the big thing is to make sure that it's done in a safe way and then answer the question once and for all with the randomized study. Adrian?
Yeah, no, I'll just note that I think this has to be one of the hardest areas in health and science that at least I've ever encountered. I think for anyone who's been, has lived unfortunately with long COVID or PASC, I mean, they were going along with their life and not expecting something like this. And so, especially early on when COVID comes out, oh, it's a bad flu. Well, that's the really bad flu. Like, what are we talking about here? And so I think, if you just think about the population and essentially a new disease that has some overlap with other syndromes or other areas, it's still really challenging because we don't fully understand all the different causes and contributing factors here, which also makes it hard to understand what's the different types of interventions. And then when there's some similarities with other areas of health, which have been studied and have some real challenges of understanding what works, then you start having other difficulties in saying like, should we just assume something on this way that it won't work or it will work or this and that? And that is defined as research, unfortunately, that we don't know all the answers. What we have here is a platform to get those answers, and it's going to be a continuous journey. Eldrin highlighted some examples in different areas of health for which for many years we had assumed something, so-called dogma, and it turned out when you did the larger study, the dogma was not quite right. Actually, it was the opposite answers here. And so just from the Q&A and the conversation that's in the dialogue here, it's very clear that there are no easy answers here. Everyone's committed to get the best answers in a better way than we've had. And I think this is going to be a continuous process with the platform for Recover. And also want to thank everyone for reaching out and being really strong advocates in terms of the importance of PASC and long COVID. Everyone's listening. And final thing is that I wish we had consensus on everything. And I think the difficulty in PASC and long COVID is that there's not 100% consensus for most everything. I think, in some cases, we get to 51% and say that's consensus, but it's not a consensus for every component, and certainly not close to 100%. And so I think that underscores why it's so important, the efforts that we have here.
So just to quickly add on to that, are there separate analyses that are planned for patients that are experiencing PEM versus those without PEM in the protocol?
So the details, Christine, are still being worked out. I will say, as I mentioned, there are thoughts about which populations should necessarily go into the trial, for example, but understanding that PEM is a condition that lots of people can experience, and lots of people, particularly with long COVID, can experience. Certainly, we want to make sure that after any of the exercise sessions, that there's follow-up to evaluate everyone for whether or not they have symptoms of post-exertional malaise, and to be able to then alter whatever the exercise intervention is in order to make sure that people stay safe during that. So it would be a blanket safety evaluation for every person in the trial, because we know that everyone might be, at risk for developing PEM.
And then I guess the other thing, because I saw some of the comments that come through, is that it's very clear the concerns about people who have PEM or have had PEM or have seen people with PEM, and the different issues with exercise intolerance that's also been seen with long COVID. And so I think one of the things that's come up through the various discussions is being really attentive to the safety and safeguards and how things should be monitored or even included as part of the intervention. So I think these are examples where people are trying to translate what's been the prior research in the area, but also noting that we may or may not know fully what the exact overlap is with long COVID PASC and ME/CFS. So it's complicated, to say the least, and those living with it know that fully.
All right. And we may circle back to this topic, but I want to make sure we can cover some of the other questions that we've had. One of these is that there's good evidence that biochemical signals of inflammation in individuals with long COVID are not the same in blood and in cerebrospinal fluid. The success of any trial is going to involve documenting improvements in biomarkers, such as these. So have any biomarkers been developed that can reliably be utilized, or the discussions around those?
I'm happy to start again. Let's see. So we are still learning. We're still learning, right? There's so much that we have to learn about PASC. There's so much that we are hoping to learn from Recover Long cohorts. There's lots of biomarkers and things that are being studied within that space, and then people outside of Recover, lots of things that have been that are being studied, and people are trying to keep up with the literature. I think every week we get some email about a new thing that has come out with regard to papers that we should be reading and evaluating. I think first and foremost, we are very interested in making sure that the success of the trials is defined by patient improvement. So that's how are people feeling and functioning. But you're right in that biomarkers are also going to be an important part of this. Some of those, if we're thinking about inflammation, if we're thinking about viral persistence, some of those things we might be able to use from prior disease processes, for example, or if we're thinking about reactivation being something, can we measure EBV at the beginning and then at the end? So some of the things are going to be in existence from what we already know. And we will learn whether or not they're improved or not as we go through the course of the trials. There are some more specific things that people are looking at, specifically to measure like viral persistence, for example. There's an assay that has shown some differences in the spike protein antigen between those people who have PASC and those people who don't have definitions of PASC. So, and we're hoping to incorporate some of those things within the trials themselves. But lots of things still to learn, lots of opportunities out there, interested in people's kind of thoughts and ideas, and also want to make sure that those biomarkers are aligning with how people are feeling and functioning.
One of the things to note is that through the whole Recover program, including the clinical trials, because there's these tensions of so many unknowns, like trying to understand exactly what's happening or causing long COVID, with the tension of like, hey, we need answers now. We need interventions that will improve someone's health, their function, their quality of life. How to do things in parallel. And so, having all this available to, develop some of those answers is really critical, because I don't think anyone in this community is really excited about serial answers that takes decades. And so that's why there's so much trying to be done to do things in parallel with a multi-pronged strategy with different platforms for different areas of long COVID.
And I want to make sure we're also getting our patient voice in this. And so, Marta, Christine, are there any items that come to mind that that you want to address, or that have been sort of prompted thoughts from this discussion so far?
I can say that during the process, I did give my input in the fact that although it may be difficult for me to do exercise intolerance exam or exercises for them, that I would do so because of my deep desire to have a treatment or a remedy. So as long COVID patients, I would say the majority of us are willing to go back and forth for testing so that we can get closer to a treatment or a cure. There's a willingness there that perhaps I would not have in other cases. But there is, again, heightened sense of wanting to resolve some issues around being able to exercise a little bit more would be helpful to me. And also, I just say most important would be some of the brain issues that we have challenges with: memory fog, memory loss, stuttering. I never stuttered in my life. And I forgot to mention the other important one is anxiety. I never had an anxiety attack in my entire life. And all of a sudden, I've had a couple of those. They're very disconcerting. And I would like to find some form of treatment. So there is a willingness from the majority of the patient population to undergo testing and trials in order to get closer to some form of treatment.
I think that also echoes one of the other questions that we received. So about how the trials are going to be pairing the symptom clusters and enrollment into the different trials. Are patients within a trial then subgroup by a symptom cluster? And then what if they have more than one symptom? Are they then restricted or limited, or who goes where? How can that help be decided?
I'll talk about viral persistence as an example. So we know certainly that up to 60% of patients who have long COVID have overlapping symptoms. Some of that data has come out from the Recover long COVID cohorts and other kind of sources. But we have tried to be fairly deliberate about allowing people within the viral persistence protocol, if they are the first arm, for example, if they have not only brain fog, but also autonomic dysfunction or also PM, that they might potentially be an option to enroll in for all of those three symptom clusters. There are certain inclusion criteria for each of those symptom clusters. And so there's not only saying like I have brain fog, but there's also other information and other tests that kind of need to be passed, I guess, in order to be included in that particular trial. But we would be very interested in, the worst symptoms. If you didn't pass the other ones, that would be kind of the worst symptoms. That brain fog might be your worst symptom, but you might not have as much, issue with the other two symptoms. So within viral persistence, there's the opportunity to be across. We have tried to be pretty thoughtful about making sure that people aren't necessarily in multiple trials themselves at the same time. If there's drugs involved, for example, because we want to be able to understand the effect and we don't want one thing affecting another. But the details about how that will all work to make sure we're as inclusive as possible, allow people to be as part of however much they want to be as possible, the details of that are still being worked out.
All right, and I want to circle back to Christine again to share her thoughts on this discussion. Christine, what's coming to mind for you?
Sure. I think what came to mind the most was just that I appreciate that we're having this discussion and that we're having it in this space. It's a really good opportunity to get input from patient perspective and for those questions to be answered. I'm looking through the Q&A and I see some names I recognize, some that I don't, and I just want to assure everyone that we are listening.
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions down in there, so we're going to try and get through get through a few more of these before our time is up. And this goes back to our patient reps about just, can you expand a little bit more about how patient input was incorporated into the planning? Like, is it weighted? Have you heard, there's been concerns about patient input not being given, and just kind of just really valuing the input of those who have lived the experience. Christine, Marta, I think this might go to you, and then a little bit to Kanecia and yep.
Yeah.
Oh, and yeah, Renee.
I can give you an example. Actually, I was in the stomach, a gastrointestinal breakout group, and speaking about what was really most important to me. And I did give a comment that while it's disturbing to have vomiting and nausea, and I'm experiencing that right now, actually, some nausea, it's not as important to me. I kind of weighed it. It's not as important to me as my heart racing or my lungs not functioning well. I have scarred lungs, for example, right now. So I was able to give that kind of discussion because it seemed that there were going to be some challenging clinical trials with that group. And so they did take my feedback and they said, we hear you, we're putting this in our notes and we will include this in our discussion. So sort of the weighing of the importance of that study was taken into account. I felt it was, and it was told to me that they were moving it forward. So that's just one example. Renee?
Right. Thank you, Marta. So the patient and community reps on the protocol working teams are full members. And so it is, as researchers come to the table with past experience, learned and lived of how they see a clinical trial being developed or areas to focus on, the same works with the patient representative. It's not a voting structure, it's a consensus structure. It's developing knowledge, co-developing knowledge and sharing knowledge and trying to lift and create a protocol that is taking in all those factors. Now, one thing that we do is we do document patient and community feedback, and we follow up regarding influence. And we want to do that because it helps make this protocol better. To know that if something was recommended as part of a team and it wasn't accepted, that we, I'll put myself in the researcher camp, we as researchers know why. It helps researchers think more critically about decisions they're making, and it's a conversation and it's consensus. So we're lifting systems to have the patient input as part of the working group team to be equal, because we're developing strategies for things to be created, the protocols created through consensus. But again, not like researchers, not every item that a patient rep may recommend may not be in the protocol, and it's the same for the research team on the protocol. It's built together.
Hey, Christine, one other note just to add to that is, like, it's not going to be done there just with the protocol. It's going to be through and through. So, like, as the studies are launched, there'll be some early learnings in terms of what the experience is or getting others to join. And then finally the results. So how that's disseminated and shared with the communities. And so my guess is that just like the beginning of this effort has been complicated, is that getting results out in a way that's understood will also be complicated. And so making sure people understand that, and especially with all these overlapping issues of the different symptoms and syndromes.
Thank you. So the next question, we've seen this come up again, also few questions in the Q&A that we've received. So how's real world data such as electronic health records being integrated into these trials? How are you factoring in patients who couldn't get those PCR tests earlier in the pandemic, or those who have had vaccines and been boosted or not been boosted? How is all this playing into these trials?
Christine, I will start with the people who couldn't get information or couldn't get tested at the time. And I will say that this is an area where patient advocacy, especially Christine on this call around, has been so awesome in making sure that I not only am aware of it, but also really thinking carefully about this and thinking about this across all the protocols in Recover. We are opening up the Recover trials to make sure that some people who have probable or suspected COVID could in fact still participate, especially if they had, probable or suspected COVID prior to when tests were widely available, so that we can make sure that we are understanding that population as well. And it's not just, we understand that some of those patients have the most severe disease. We also understand that those patients didn't necessarily have access to testing because it wasn't widely available. There's also a lot to learn from that particular group. And so our hope is to understand how duration of symptoms might even affect how you may respond or recover in these particular trials. So certainly thankful for Christine and Marta for helping us to really be thoughtful and inclusive of patients who didn't have access to testing. And I forget your other questions, Christine. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, I was just kind of how this fits into the larger Recover picture. Clinical trials are one piece, and then there's the real world data component and the observational cohort, and kind of how is this all hitting, fixing, coming together to identify some of these solutions.
Yeah, other people can probably weigh in on that as well. But, we have meetings with the Recover cohort leadership, the adult cohort leadership in particular, and making sure that we're asking very similar questions so that we can cross-compare information using things like the common data elements that have been identified. There will be both Recover sites and non-Recover sites within the clinical trials, but certainly those Recover sites will allow us to capitalize on some of the information that's already been gathered within the Recover data. We're going to use the EHR to try to identify what we call phenotype patients so that we can more quickly identify them for the trial. And then I'm excited about the wearables that the cohorts are using as well. And that's a form of real world data to be able to really track like heart rate and things of that nature on a consistent basis. That we are also collaborating. Actually, after this, I'm going to a meeting with the Recover cohort to figure out how we might be able to do that together. So.
All right, thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. So we have time for maybe two more questions here. And Renee, did you have a question that you had seen pop through that you wanted to make sure that we were able to touch on?
Well, I was going to actually type a response, but I accidentally hit answer live. But somebody wrote about patients as researchers, and you're right. And so I don't want to, if my language created a separation of, somebody fits in a certain box and another, in another box. I'm wrong on that. So I want to acknowledge that, and that's what I was going to type to you, but I'll answer it live instead.
Thanks, Renee. All right, and just to kind of help us close out, what are you looking forward to most in the next few months? What can our audience be excited about, be looking forward to? What are you looking forward to? And we'll do everybody's on deck for this one. So next few months, what are you looking forward to? What should our audience know?
Yes, I'll start. First patient, first visit. It's nothing more exciting. And I talk a lot, and I apologize for my laryngitis. I'll just emphasize that, when I'm in the CCU, I teach that the worst thing to do is nothing. So let's answer a question. And then if the answer moves the needle, great. If it doesn't, we've learned. And then let's move to the next intervention.
Yeah, I would echo what Dr. Lewis said. I am just really looking forward to the clinical trials launching and to see what the results are.
So I'll add to this, and so it's not only kind of just getting the different trials started, but also having these different platforms going. So then to get to Eldrin's comment is being able to more seamlessly answer more and more questions about long COVID. I think just a discussion today, I saw all sorts of things like we have over the last year, ideas and concepts that need to be tested. And so how do we move those things in a streamlined way? The hardest thing for everything is building that foundation to do so. And especially if you think about the 5 programs here, it's really setting up the foundation to continuously do those studies to get people answers. But certainly the first patient enrolled, first participant enrolled for each of these programs will be terrific. And then also the first results that come out.
All right, the clock is against us.
Oh,
a couple seconds, Renee, go.
I'm excited to continue to work with patient and patient advocacy groups to bridge that lived experience and for the first clinical trial to stand up.
All right, Marta.
I had COVID. I got COVID in November 2020. This has been a long haul. So I'm very optimistic that these clinical trials will create some form of treatment that will alleviate some of my issues. So I'm very excited.
Great. And Dr. Zimmerman, close us out.
Getting started, moving, let's go.
All right. And please join me again in thanking our patient representatives and the folks from our clinical trials team here today for taking the time to share these updates with us. And thank you to our audience too for all of your great questions. We had so many and we weren't able to really get to all of them. We could spend days, and that's what this team has actually been doing, spending months working on these. The FAQ to those questions is going to be posted along with the recording of this webinar and links to those previous ones on the November webinar on biomarkers. Those will be available on recovercovid.org. That FAQ is going to include answers to the questions that were submitted that are relevant to today's webinar, including those that were submitted in advance or during the session. So if you didn't see your answer or didn't hear that answer, look for that FAQ for those responses. Anything that's more general or broader can be addressed in future webinars, as well as some of the broader questions in our general FAQ section as well. So as we close, we just want to invite you to come back and attend our future R3 webinars. We're going to continue to dive deeper into some of these topics that have been discussed. And if you haven't already, sign up to get the updates for future announcements. We'll be back on May 9th for our next webinar as we continue to look at Recover in Action. And we're going to be diving into PASC in children and adolescents. So if there are topics that you want to learn more about, be sure to drop those into the survey on your screen that Shane is going to be flashing up momentarily. And just thank you again for joining us and being with us. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. This concludes today's R3 webinar. Thank you.